Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Je suis Boris Proulx, journaliste au Devoir et je modérerai cette conférence de presse. Hi, welcome to all. I am Boris Proulx, reporter for Le Devoir, and I'll be moderating this press conference. After a few remarks, we will take questions in the room and then on Zoom. So if you're attending on Zoom, you can use the raise hand function at any moment during this press conference and I'll hand you the floor. Vous pouvez utiliser la fonction lever la main et poser votre question dans la langue officielle de votre choix. Today's press conference is following the studying effects of Cannabis Act on Indigenous People. On the stage, there is Senator Brian Francis, Chair of the Committee, Senator David Arnot, Deputy Chair of the Committee, et la sénatrice Michèle Audette, également membre du comité. On that, Senators, you have the floor.
Good morning, bonjour. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Nindalusing Brian Francis. My name is Brian Francis. I'm a senator from Ebiwit, also known as Prince Edward Island. I am also the chair of the Senate Committee on Indigenous Peoples. I'm here with two other members, Deputy Chair David Arnot and Senatrice Michèle Audette. I'm very disappointed to say that we are here on this National Indigenous History Month to highlight yet another example of how Indigenous peoples are being let down by Canada. Once again, a government that says it is committed to building a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples based on the recognition of rights, respect, and partnership has failed to live up to its promise. Once again, Indigenous peoples have been excluded from participation in the economic prosperity of the country. And once again, little regard has been given to how our lives have been impacted. My colleagues and I are here to share with you the results of our committee's review of the implementation of the Cannabis Act and its impact on Indigenous peoples and communities. Our committee was severely disappointed but not surprised by what we heard during our study. Over the next few minutes, I will take you through some of the issues and recommendations that we have identified. Senator Arnott will subsequently touch on other key recommendations, and Senatrice Audette will provide an overview in French before we take your questions. One more quick thing to note, our report and recommendations are largely focused on First Nations testimony, as the committee was unable to hear from many Inuit and Métis witnesses during our short study. The committee recognizes that Inuit and Métis perspectives related to cannabis are critical. We encourage the expert panel, which Senator Arnott will talk about in more detail, to hear from these groups. Many of the issues I will touch upon next could and should have been addressed 5 years ago. First, the federal government's consultations with First Nations before and after legalization were inadequate at best. This created an obstacle for First Nations seeking to reap the economic benefits of legalization. Chief Darcy Gray of the Listicush Mi'kmaq First Nation said consultation focused on health, well-being, and concerns about access to cannabis by young people. Perfectly fair concerns. But Chief Gray also said there was little discussion on the economic opportunities that could flow from legalization, even though he made certain to raise that point. We seemed to be an afterthought, he said, something to be dealt with once things were set up and the market secured by others. This oversight, to put it as charitably as I can, cannot readily be corrected. The cannabis market is now largely saturated. First Nations entrepreneurs will have to work twice as hard to gain a foothold in this market. As lawyer Sarah Mainville told the committee, First Nations governments could be models of productive, responsible, and economically sustainable communities with the right tools. However, she noted that the promise of equity and opportunity has certainly not been made, either in 2018 or 2022, for Indigenous peoples generally and First Nations specifically. Second, federal leadership has been just as abysmal. Whether intentional or not, the government has hidden behind the issues of jurisdiction to avoid its responsibilities. The Cannabis Act saw the federal government use its criminal law power to set out the scope for the legal sale and distribution of cannabis, but it left the matter of regulation to the provinces and territories. When our committee studied the bill in 2018, many groups recommended the bill be amended to include language explicitly recognizing First Nations jurisdiction over the distribution, possession, and sale of cannabis in their lands. This recommendation was ignored, and First Nations across the country are paying the price. Some provinces and territories have outright ignored First Nation requests for agreements to produce and sell cannabis, leaving them effectively barred from the market. Elsewhere, other First Nations found they had to closely mirror the province's cannabis regime to get their own regime up and running. So much for respecting the inherent rights of self-government and self-determination of First Nations, which are recognized in and protected under Section 35 of the Constitution, as well as in various articles of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Lastly, there is also an important public health dimension. Due to the residential schools and other federal government policies that aim to control, assimilate, and erase us, Indigenous people continue to live with a complex legacy of intergenerational trauma, which has been linked to substance use, addiction, and other harms. As such, the public health effects of the implementation of the Cannabis Act on Indigenous peoples deserve careful consideration. Dr. Evan Adams, Deputy Chief Medical Officer of the Public Health at Indigenous Services Canada, told our committee that gaps in health data for Indigenous peoples mask inequality and reduce the potential to develop effective policies that address existing socio-economic and health inequalities. For this reason, the committee believes that the federal government should work with Indigenous peoples and communities to develop a research strategy that will identify and fill the gaps in Indigenous-specific data related to cannabis. The committee also recommends that the government increase its funding for the development and update of Indigenous-led public health information on cannabis. While the government provided some funding for culturally appropriate public education materials, witnesses said more must be done, including distinctions-based, age-appropriate, and gender-specific information. Meanwhile, the federal government's non-insured health benefits program, which among other things provides coverage for some prescription medicine to eligible First Nations and Inuit clients, does not cover cannabis for medical reasons. The committee heard that a number of harm reduction initiatives rely on cannabis, but lack of access and coverage can undermine these efforts. As such, our committee recommends that Indigenous Services Canada cover cannabis for medical purposes under this program. In sum, it is clear to us that inadequate consultation and a lack of federal leadership have prevented First Nation groups across Canada from profiting from economic opportunities afforded by the legalization of cannabis, and that the public health measures related to cannabis are also lacking. However, there are always ways to improve the situation. I will now invite Senator Arnot to explain how the panel of experts I alluded to earlier can improve matters and to discuss some of the additional recommendations our committee has made. Well, Alan, thank you. Senator Arnot.
Thank you, Senator Francis. I'd like to tell you that the witnesses that we heard didn't shy away from the problems of the Cannabis Act and its administration, and they came with solutions. I think that's really important to say, because they had ideas about how this could be cured, and they think they had good ideas, and we put that in the report. Section 151 of the Cannabis Act requires the federal health minister to review the administration of the act. To that end, the government has convened an expert panel to lead what the government calls as a credible and inclusive review. Our work on this study has been motivated in large part by the desire to help the panel in its work by canvassing the issues with the people most affected by them. In all, we made 13 recommendations that should be acted on as a first step in addressing the wrongs that the witnesses identified. Our first recommendation is for the panel to engage in substantive consultations with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Senator Francis has clearly outlined the regrettable gaps in the consultation processes that have occurred to date. Robust consultation that treats economic concerns on a par with health and addictions concerns would be an important first step. We also recommend that the expert panel propose solutions to the problems that they hear so that those problems can be resolved expeditiously. Although expeditiously may not be the right word given that many of these problems had been identified in our report in 2018. Another means of improving the status quo would be for the First Nations to share the excise tax revenue that the government collects on cannabis sales. From the they share that. The federal government shares it with provinces and territories, but it should be shared with First Nations governments. And Manny Jules, the Chief Commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission, noted that he had proposed amendments to the Act to accommodate First Nations fiscal and regulatory cannabis jurisdiction for 4 years. He was very precise, concise, and innovative, and we strongly recommend recommendation number 7 on page 24 for those reasons. Sharing the excise tax could be a fundamental part of economic reconciliation, an opportunity for the government to truly put its money where its mouth is and begin to make up for the economic opportunities that First Nations people have lost. That's why we're recommending that the Finance Canada Department work with the First Nations to identify options for the development of an excise tax sharing framework. The final 2 recommendations I'll touch on would support First Nations sovereignty. We urge the Federal Minister of Health to introduce legislation to amend the Cannabis Act so that First Nations can regulate the possession, sale, and distribution of cannabis on their lands. This would allow First Nations to do what they think best for their communities and resolve some of the jurisdictional tensions between federal, provincial governments and the First Nations governments and leaders. What we need is cooperation and collaboration. But this means little without resources to enforce the First Nations laws and bylaws. Despite the jurisdictional issues, some First Nations have enacted cannabis regimes on reserves, but those same jurisdictional issues make enforcement difficult, if not impossible. Since the Cannabis Act does not specifically provide First Nations with the authority to oversee cannabis activities, police and prosecutors do not have the ability to enforce First Nations laws and regulations. And First Nations police services cannot lawfully enforce First Nations laws they are not authorized to do under the relevant provincial legislation. That's why we recommend the government establish a legislative mechanism for enforcement of ban bylaws and other cannabis-related laws by all police services and to ensure adequate funding for this is available. These recommendations are practical, they're achievable, and they're long overdue. There is still time for the government to improve a situation that has once more left Indigenous people on the outside looking in. Senatrice Audette will now give some remarks before questions. Thank you.
Jusqu'à maintenant, chers collègues, les sénateurs, merci beaucoup. Ni pour Ogadotode, leur territoire, le peuple Anishinaabe. Alors, en quelques minutes, pour ma part, je vous partagerai, je vais commencer avec une citation. Je suis arrivée déjà dans cet exercice où les travaux avaient déjà commencé, mais celle-là va m'avoir ramené à l'importance de consulter, d'échanger, de participer, de collaborer avec les peuples autochtones. Et dans ce cas-ci, la citation commence par la chef Perron du Conseil Mohawk de Ganawagé. Elle nous rappelle « La loi sur le cannabis elle-même ne tient pas compte des droits des Premières Nations à l'autodétermination et leurs compétences, car elle ne prévoit pas la possibilité des Premières Nations de réglementer l'industrie en dehors des cadres législatifs, fédéraux et provinciaux. Et pour ne pas répéter tout ce que mes collègues ont partagé sur l'ensemble du rapport et des témoins plus des recommandations, je vais peut-être nous rappeler collectivement que, sachant qu'il va y avoir des projets de loi qui vont traiter sur la sécurité publique, la santé publique et la santé mentale, l'importance pour le comité d'experts de faire ou d'agir pour que le gouvernement du Canada, lors de l'élaboration des mesures législatives là, en lien avec la police des Premières Nations, qu'il y ait une collaboration avec les provinces, avec les territoires et surtout les Premières Nations. Et au sein des Premières Nations, on parle de toute l'expertise là, qui émane de nos nations pour travailler sur des mécanismes législatifs concernant le cannabis pour nos corps policiers dans nos communautés. Un autre aspect super important au niveau de la santé mentale et publique, trop souvent, on va amener une lunette réconciliation économique, une lunette, là c'est moi qui parle de l'intérieur, même si c'est une vue de l'extérieur, d'une lunette réconciliation économique. Pour beaucoup de parents, cette loi-là va faire en sorte aussi qu'il y a eu un impact sur la santé mentale et émotionnelle d'une jeune génération en devenir. On parle de nos enfants et de nos jeunes adultes. Alors, l'importance de faire en sorte aussi que le comité d'experts indépendants puisse évaluer le cadre législatif là, sur cette loi-là, mais aussi de recueillir des points de vue dans l'examen et surtout de fournir des conseils d'experts de nos communautés en santé et bien sûr pour pouvoir les transmettre au ministre de la Santé et à la ministre de la Santé mentale et des dépendances sur la manière d'atteindre les objectifs de cette loi et pour mettre en œuvre les recommandations qu'on a formulées. Des recommandations de gens qui sont venus de différents milieux, différentes expertises, mais pour faire en sorte aussi que, tant au niveau économique, on puisse participer, mais au niveau, je le répète, sécurité publique, santé mentale et santé publique, que nous ayons tous les outils et les moyens nécessaires pour faire en sorte qu'on puisse protéger les plus vulnérables. Merci.
Merci, sénateur, sénatrice. On va maintenant passer à la période de questions. On va prendre d'abord les questions dans la salle, puis sur Zoom. Si vous êtes sur Zoom, vous pouvez utiliser la fonction « Lever la main » et je vais vous passer la parole après les questions ici dans la salle. So first questions in the room, please limit yourself to one question, one follow-up. We'll start off with Brett Forster, CBC.
Hello, Senators. Thanks for taking our questions today. The first one is just for all three of you. What does this situation say about the Liberal government's commitment to actually implementing Indigenous rights to self-government rather than just promising to do it?
Well, I guess I'll start. I would say from my perspective and as an Indigenous person, the government certainly has some work to do because what we see and based on our report here, that hasn't happened. So going forward, there's certainly some work that still has to be done.
Anybody else?
Well, I would say this is a golden opportunity for the government to act. We've given them clear recommendations, and if they follow those recommendations, it will really set the stage for a reconciliation, certainly economic reconciliation.
I know we're talking about this report, but your question is very important that also can bring other concern that I see since I arrived almost 2 years now here at the Senate, that there's too many times that we miss the opportunity to enhance or to put in practices, I don't know in English, that the goodwill, the words that we heard, but the action or the reality when we see, I don't know if we were able to co-construct this bill with Indigenous people, with the expertise that we have across Canada. I wasn't there, but it's a question that can be asked to the federal government. Where was the voice of people? We can see that I'm not sure it was in there, because this is why I started with that quote.
Thank you. And again, for all three of you, how is this impacting people on the ground in the communities? The lack of enforcement, the jurisdictional gap, the confusion, the economic exclusion. How is this hurting or impacting real people?
Well, I think, I live in a First Nation community, and for us, it impacts us in every aspect that you've just mentioned, from economic-wise, socially, and so on. We've been left out completely, while others have been able to move forward since the cannabis legislation was, presented into law. And as usual, we're behind the 8 ball here now, trying to get caught up. The market is saturated, so our First Nations have to work twice as hard now to get a foothold into the market, when we should have been there, as equal partners right from the start.
I'd like to add also, merci, Sénateur Francis, just my community as an example, Maliotenam, Ouachat Mike Maliotenam, who has a police force. And not long ago, it was on the news, first page on the news with La Presse, where even them, they have a hard time to respond to the opioid, drugs, all kind of drugs. And I know we have to work in silo over here, when for me, this is why it was so important that we put this recommendation, or this aspect of knowing that there is a legislation coming, or a bill on First Nation policing, that police support people. We're in a crisis right now. And with that, with no resource, expertise, and the second circle, I would say, la deuxième ligne of intervention, or people that are trying to walk beside life or support life, it's very difficult. So if we were able to participate in the economy that brings this, la loi sur le cannabis, I'm pretty sure the First Nation community, I cannot speak for them, but knowing some of them, they would reinvest in social programs, or safety, or public health, and so on.
Next up is Fraser Needham, APTN.
I'm just wondering, in talking to some of the different First Nations, that because you just have to look around. There's lots of First Nations on reserve that are participating in the cannabis market. But was the matter that going through the provinces is that they found it too frustrating to get permits, or it was too slow, or there was no recognition, so the First Nations just left it, and then the sort of this, I guess, other providers started moving into the communities, or how, what kind of feedback did you get on that type of, and when they tried to pursue the legal market, I guess?
Well, thank you for that question. I'd like to say that there were a lot of jurisdictional issues that arose, but what I'd like to emphasize is the idea, and we heard it from Sarah Mainville, and it's on page 15 of the report. Cooperative federalism is a framework for cannabis reform. So what she was talking about was cooperation, collaboration, and constructive solutions, working with federal, provincial, territorial governments and First Nations government in concert to address those concerns. And in fact, there's an exemplar model that comes from Saskatchewan, because there's an agreement with the Whitecoat Dakota First Nation, the Saskatchewan Liquor and Gaming Authority, and the Saskatchewan government to amend the Cannabis Control Act in Saskatchewan. So it's an example of working with First Nations together to address common concerns, doing it in a proper way with respect, and getting a better result for everyone.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, just to add to that, it's all about working collaboratively and working together. And that happened with the First Nations when this all came into being. Then there wouldn't be some First Nations kind of taking matters into their own hands and creating their own rules, and others trying to fall under the provincial rules, which seem to be very restrictive. If it would have been that collaboration with the government and the First Nations right off the bat, then we wouldn't be here today, probably.
And just as a follow-up, did you get the sense that it seems in the cannabis market there hasn't been some of the rules, I guess, and even in the non-Indigenous market, that limit suppliers or sales. It's an oversaturated market, and the non-Indigenous. Did you get the sense that the First Nations would like to restrict how many retailers are, for example, on a particular First Nation, things like that, or have a little more control in that area?
I didn't get that sense, no. I can't
Okay.
respond to that.
Next question. We have a question, Kirsten?
I was just wondering, is there an estimation on the amount of revenue that First Nations communities make on the sale of cannabis, or is that kind of outside of the scope of your study?
I don't recall that. I'm thinking it's probably outside the scope for a study, but I don't. Hmm? It's outside the scope, yeah, we didn't discuss that.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I'm from a world where everything is out of scope lately. Or I'm not from a world. I'm learning that everything I bring seems to be out of scope. So your question is good, and it's something you can ask also to the federal government, because not because we didn't ask the question that you don't deserve an answer.
Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up? Or that's it? All right, we'll go on Zoom then. I see Tara Deschamps, the Canadian Press. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you can share a bit more around the excise tax. We've heard quite a bit from the broader cannabis industry about how they'd like changes with it. But I'm wondering specifically within the Indigenous community, what sorts of changes you think to the excise tax would be helpful?
Well, that's a great question, but we highlighted that on page 24 of our report, and we quoted Manny Jules, who I mentioned earlier. He's an expert in this area. He's been dealing with it for 40 years or so, and he has a 7-part program that he would like to, proposal that he would like to see enacted, and it would be about sharing excise tax revenues with First Nations communities, so that there would be a buildup of resources which could be invested either in the community in an entrepreneurial way or used by the community as the community sees fit. It seems to me that that's a very practical and a good recommendation, which we strongly feel should be implemented by the federal government.
And just as a follow-up, I'm curious if there's a timeline that you think would be helpful for the slate of recommendations that you've put forward. Obviously, we're 5 years into legalization now, and so I'm wondering how fast you'd like to see some of these things.
You go, I go.
Go, yeah.
I would say there's places that we say, je sais pas c'est quoi en anglais, on est courageux, or that there's some place that we're recommending that we would appreciate, or it would be important that they would come back to us in December 2023. Sorry, my Franglish. But also in the long term, because it has a long effect on us, in the communities. And this is why we're asking, and going back to thinking it's an out-of-scope question, we are also recommending to have a place that we can study that we can collect data, that we can stay informed of what is good, what is not good, and what is the impact to influence the policy or policy makers, or to influence people and us due diligence to change or amend the legislation. On the financial aspect, like I said, if we were able to reinvest where we think it's very important, for me, we missed an opportunity when this bill was introduced. And because our voice was in there since the beginning until today, we have to do reports and remind Canada, we are here and we need those recommendations to be implemented.
Merci. Je ne vois plus de questions sur Zoom. So unless one of you have a further question for the senators, we'll call it a day. This puts an end to this press conference. Merci beaucoup, sénateurs, sénatrices.